Before I begin this episode, a few quick things. I gotta fact check myself.
I made a mistake last episode when speaking about the Ravenite.
The Ravenite Club was not formerly the Knights of Alto. That's a rumor. I thought my source was solid, but an audience member, user Gunter Smith, brought to my attention an OC Shorts video in which he makes a much more solid argument. It's nearby, but not the same building. Expect very rare photos of Joey Testa and Freddie Denome during the episode, and there's going to be a bonus after the credits of this episode. One's going to be the Greedy Humpty Dumpty cartoon. It's like 2 minutes long. I always use it as analogous to Paul. I doubt most of you give a shit about that, but since I own the right to use it, I figured I might as well put it up there.
Then after that 2-minute Greedy Humpty Dumpty cartoon, there are some very rare photos relating to Freddie, and these are ones that I haven't used before that, as far as I know, aren't on Google as of the time I'm making this video. You're also going to see Richard Kuklinski in the credits, but for those of you familiar with DeMeo, don't worry. I didn't suddenly believe Richard's trolling. He was never a hitman. My sources include Dominic Polifroni, the Richard Kuklinski investigators. Dominic Polifroni's the guy who took Richard down. Pete LaFrocia, who was sometimes member of the DeMeo crew. Montiglio, way too many sources to name right here. I'll flesh them out in my Richard Kuklinski documentary. Somebody accused me of changing my mind on Richard even knowing Roy. Although I have no problem changing my mind if I find superior evidence that I was wrong. I think that's a good thing. I didn't hear. No, the Iceman short that I made, all I ever said was he wasn't a hitman. He even played a clip where a cop who was a detective on the Roy case said that he was a victim of Roy, not a hitman.
Finally, Crime Spot New York and now myself are investigating evidence that Roy DeMeo was involved in child trafficking of underage boys. I agree with Crime Spot. I think he probably was. He was a highly disturbed guy after all, and he was making hamburger out of his victims and selling child porn. It'd be really hard to make a TV series about this guy without toning it down.
I put a Patreon link below. These videos are a lot of work. I invest a lot of money in them because I want people to enjoy them, but if you can help out, I certainly could use it. Now, if you enjoy this video, hit like and subscribe. And if you don't, well, forget there's an unlike button, or that I even exist if you really hate it, and mosey on over to Sammy the Bull. In any event, it's time to begin. We're going back in time, back to the summer of 1977. People presume that mobsters are all sociopaths and psychopaths, but the truth's a lot more complicated than that. Well, the mafia can easily be described as an evil institution because it inherently relies on predatory and parasitic behavior that causes maladaptive suffering on others in more vulnerable positions. It's also a subculture. The people who learn bad values aren't always inherently bad people due to some narcissistic trait or other neurological abnormality that causes indifference to suffering. Of course, we all know about the Holocaust and Stalin. I'm going to give you a more recent example. The Rwanda genocide. 800,000 people, members of the Tutsi ethnic group, were slaughtered, hacked to death into pieces. Children, women, men, normal people. And while the government might have ordered it, it was normal people who also carried it out. Research has found that mobsters, on average, actually possess less psychopathy than other prisoners who committed similar crimes, including sex trafficking, murder, and theft. They're more likely to show compassion, genuine concern, and remorse. But this comes with a caveat. These were low-level mobsters. Suspect, like CEOs and politicians, psychopaths are more disproportionately found at higher tiers. If you believe the accuracy of the research, psychopaths are between 0.6% and roughly 1% of the population. I think it's a little bit more than that because I don't think every psychopath answers research questions honestly. But either way, most politicians and CEOs aren't psychopaths. Psychopaths are just more disproportionately represented. And it doesn't take much to get above 1% to be disproportionate. Of course, I realize there's a difference between sociopaths and psychopaths, but sociopathy doesn't seem to be as high among mobsters either. If politics and business, which require patience and daily managed dull routines without much appreciation in the beginning, appeal to psychopaths because of the potential for power, wealth, and respect, well, then it's very foreseeable that something like the mafia, which is inherently predatory, and that's not going to stop a psychopath, and where the gratification is much more immediate and assured, it's going to be even more appealing to psychopaths, and they're probably going to be even more disproportionately represented in their numbers, even if most mobsters aren't psychopaths. Psychopath and sociopath are highly debated terms that are both known as what's medically called antisocial personality disorder, sometimes called sociopathy. It's a mental disorder in which people have no regard for right and wrong. They know what it is, they just don't care. Manipulative, sometimes sadistic, different to the rights of others, and they show no guilt or remorse. And psychopathy is a more extreme version of the antisocial personality disorder. In prison, they make you take a test for psychopathy. You score in the 20-ish range, you're a sociopath. If you score over 30, you're considered a psychopath, and it goes up to 40. Ted Bundy was a 39. Now, somebody like Roy, he wouldn't be a Ted Bundy more than likely if he was a psychopath. So he probably wouldn't have scored a 39. That's very rare even for psychopaths. It's all on a spectrum. My suspicion is that Roy was a psychopath, and that his occasional moments of empathy that divided him from somebody like Ted Bundy made him even more destructive because it became harmful to people who actually were able to forge real bonds with this guy. This was a guy who could switch his ability to empathize with others on and off like a light switch, and it would have tragic consequences for his loved ones, and for everybody else who got in his way when his boots were darker, or when he was feeling particularly greedy or in need of respect. He'd get violent or threatening if he even suggested he wasn't a good-looking guy. Now, let's think about somebody like Nino Gaggi as I begin the story again, and whose motivations are oftentimes reduced very simplistically in true crime and other podcasts to pure selfishness. When Sherry went missing, it was important enough to make the news. Sherry was young, pretty, white, and female. Plus, she was a waitress with the college potential and not just another recidivating criminal. And these are all factors that have been shown to draw readers' sympathy and concern, and this was even more true back in the 1970s. Nino was kept well informed on Roy's operations. Eventually, he learned about Sherry's murder. The details in Murder Machine, court trial, and elsewhere are very scarce. Now, I'm a visual storyteller. I want the emotions, but I also want you to see in your mind what happened. Fortunately, Capici and other sources kept those details very scarce, and I just don't know exactly what Nino was doing when he learned this information. I've always imagined him to be in his bathrobe and boxers one morning, his little chest hair protruding like some mob guy in The Sopranos or Goodfellas, sitting at the breakfast table, and his eyes, as he looks at the paper, growing enormously wide like saucers and then narrowing in anger, and trembling as he grips the paper. Well, Rose asks him, "What's wrong?" But that's just me. He could have been anywhere. What we do know is that he was pissed when he found out about Sherry's murder. And again, while every mob interpretation oftentimes tries to simplify it as self-interest, I don't think Nino was immoral a lot of the time. He had a distrust of authorities, he had trouble getting over things, he would get revenge 12 years later because it would eat at him. He did terrible things within the framework of his criminal profession, which he had been immersed in culturally since he was a little kid, so I see it as parallel to cults. He was just very conservative, old-school gangster from the 1930s, and it was very much a culture for him. And I think he had a serious moral issue with Roy murdering women, especially when they hadn't done anything to be murdered. Again, you can see that in how passionate he was when he bonded with his wife, never cheating, getting furious when Dominic cheated on his wife, which I'll talk about in the future. And that's actually something I admire a lot about Nino. It complicates him even more after his despicable pettiness with Governera and ignoring Roy's selling child porn. And as far as ignoring Roy's horrible behavior, which was heinous even by the standards of mobsters, probably wasn't just about money for Nino. Probably grew to care about Roy over the years of working with him. They bonded, became friends, not just business partners. And when you grow to care about somebody, you don't want to get them in trouble and get them killed, obviously. Now, that doesn't excuse him ignoring Roy. I think there's a moral duty to do something no matter how you feel about somebody if they're doing something extremely heinous. Not just throwing a fit, getting angry at them, and then turning ostrich. But that's the complicated personality that Nino was. Nino immediately called Roy. Oh shit, Roy wasn't stupid. He knew the boss was going to be angry at him. Nino ordered Roy to the bunker immediately, and Roy promptly drove over there. They likely met in the basement, like they usually did. Nino's expression would have been a scowl drawing into a mess of furious anger as he yelled at Roy. "You can't be just running around doing this cowboy stuff!" Roy might have had his lips pulled up in that, "Oh dear, look at me," chagrin look that he has above, his eyes tilted down a little bit. Kind of like a puppy who realizes he shouldn't have peed on the carpet. "Quinn already talked. She knew it. She had to go. But you can't just go around killing everybody you feel you have to kill without talking to me. I'm telling you, she was part of his operation. She got hurt us bad. Paulie ain't gonna like this." Later, Nino visited Paul at his home. They're likely sitting down, relaxing, and Paul probably looked a little bit concerned. Now, the death of Cherie would start to really get to Paul later on, according to interviews by Dominic, but he was kind of passive in the beginning. He had a lot on his mind. "Why did the girl have to be killed?" Paul said. "She was part of his operation. She might have talked. She had to go," Nino explained. He didn't believe it. It was not a defense he was happy with at all. This was a very uncomfortable situation, very tense. It wasn't going to be good for Nino, who spoke on this guy's behalf, and who prided himself as a gentleman. Now suddenly he's having that image tarnished. And he didn't want Roy getting whacked for both personal or financial reasons. And it probably wouldn't look great for Paul to suddenly whack Roy either, a new boss, only months after just having him made. That might make people suddenly question his judgment. Paul sighed. "Just talk to Roy. Make sure people don't start going who don't have to go," he said. Oh, people who didn't have to go were going to start going, Paul.
Now, morally or ethically speaking, although I'm far from a turn-the-other-cheek guy, and I believe revenge is sometimes justified, I have a serious problem with stealing cars from hard-working people and then complaining about snitches to begin with simply because you want to escape the consequences. That the mob made money stealing cars from civilians demonstrates they didn't have a lot of rational standards when it came to honor to begin with. But I'm going to be Roy's defense attorney for a moment. I honestly don't think Sherry was any more innocent than many of Roy's other victims, And the only reason why people have made more of a fuss about her, as I have seen online and even on a website that says it's a myth that the mob doesn't hurt women, is because she was a female, young and pretty. This was a girl who was not innocent. She was actively involved in the auto theft operation. That doesn't justify murdering her, no, but it doesn't justify murdering Quinn either. Quinn had given her a gun to hide, and if Quinn was telling her everything else, it seems like there's a good chance that he told her he was going to snitch on his co-workers in the auto theft business. Roy himself at that point had to deal with Borelli's lady friend becoming a witness at trial just 2 years prior after Henry confided in her, and Quinn was at least the fifth or sixth person who had tried to snitch on Roy at that point. So again, while it doesn't justify murder, and they shouldn't be in this situation to begin with because they're doing things to hurt other people, I can see from a criminal's perspective why Roy would chalk Cherry up to being collateral damage and it's better to be safe than sorry, especially when she had no reason to be loyal to Roy and likely would have wanted revenge for her lover's murder. There are other victims who were much more innocent who people make much less of a big deal about than Cherry. And again, that's because she was young and pretty. I hope to God someday we have better moral standards than that, though. Now, to continue.
Gambino would have never tolerated Roy's crap, but Paul did, and this would embolden Roy to commit even more murders, and to be able to act even more impulsively, like he could do whatever he wanted, and there would be no consequences. It's like telling a kid no after he's beaten up another kid, and then turning your back and walking away, very meekly. Just kind of ignoring it when he beats up the kid again. Now he feels like he can bully anybody. And by the time Paul did try to rein Roy in, he had lost complete control of the situation. Prosecutors were going to use Rico to tie the two together, and he'd come to rely on Roy so much at that point for muscle and his go-to guy when he wanted people dead and to disappear, that by then it'd be suicide to get rid of Roy because he was the only guy protecting Paul from Gotti and other disenfranchised Gambinos. In the meantime, the Veterans and Friends Club was already proven itself to be among the stupidest ideas that Paul had come up with, and in which Nino had poorly implemented. It was too small as a building, the mob obviously hadn't done their math, and it became so packed that mobsters were forced to stand in a crowd outside, where they'd chat away about whatever, and it was probably hard to police them so that they didn't accidentally spill any secrets outside in public. And yeah, people talk, and no matter how professional they are, it's very easy to spill secrets. Then on top of that, they were kind of obvious. Oh, a bunch of Italians in business suits with pinky rings. I guess they're going to the Catholic Mass. Then the younger punks showed up, and they were even more conspicuous. They parked nearby in their expensive, shiny Cadillacs, which no kid their age should be able to afford, and slipped out with a cocky grace, like they were the center of the world. And they were, in their minds. Now, these young mobsters, like the Gemini twins and Borelli, wore flashy suits with their chest hair peeking out, button-up shirts underneath. Many of the suits they wore were white, which was stylish at the time. They usually had slick, dark hair and gold chains looped around their necks, plenty of jewelry. And they looked exactly like they were. Fledgling gangsters who also wanted to be John Travolta from his recent hit Saturday Night Fever, dancing around for all the babes whenever they weren't being chased by cops. Yeah, nothing suspicious to outsiders about these kids, who had more Benjamins than they did brain cells and modesty. Since they used the same headquarters every week on Sunday, right in the middle of Brooklyn next to a thoroughfare, instead of somewhere more remote, larger, and less obvious, well, there were plenty of police to wonder what the fuck those guys were up to, and think, hey, isn't that guy a known mobster? Let's take photos and see what we can find out. Yeah, now going to the Veterans and Friends on Sunday meant reducing your chances that you were going to live a full free life without getting pinched for whatever nefarious activity you happen to be up to. Every Sunday, that was the meeting day, and that meant police with cameras outside like paparazzi for mobsters. Now, Paul originally showed up every Sunday, like the rest of them, with his cigar planted between his teeth so that he could remind everybody, even if he didn't need to, that he was the big shot around here, the most important man in New York City. But then Paul started noticing the cops, and Paul being Paul, a man who was brave when it didn't mean any consequences, but whose balls quickly shivered up when he saw police, suddenly quit coming. Fuck it, let his men deal with the cops. Paul didn't want to let them take his picture. Nino. Well, Nino lived most of his time in Florida at this point, enjoying a nice house and living with Rose. Almost part-time retired. He let Roy do a lot of his work now. And when he was in New York City with his wife, he lived like a hermit in a bunker back at home. But every Sunday, he was ordered to go, even when Paul wasn't going, and he'd be horrified and have to drive over and walk in to that little small building where all the police could take his photo and put it into a file. It must have felt like you were volunteering yourself for the hanging block. Before 1977, Nino was kind of a shadowy figure among law enforcement. Cops knew he had been seen with another mobster at a social club, but now they had a little bit more reason to focus on him, since he was consorting with other mobsters. Now, back then, since they didn't have all the sophisticated technology that we do now, a lot of the data was simply filed away in your traditional file cabinets, which made it vulnerable to damage, unfortunately. And they had the basic images and information about suspects on computers. The video that I'm playing above is from the 1970s and supposed to show surveillance and tailing somebody and so forth, to give you an idea if you're watching the video portion too. But in general, well, compared to these days, back then, all of the crime databases were a bit like something that existed from the Cretaceous period. It wasn't as neat, and it was time-consuming. But you know what? It still worked. And the police were already figuring out veterans and friends, what was a mob hotspot, possibly Gambino's. And that was in early 1977, gone back a little bit in terms of the story, right after it opened, to give you an idea of how quickly they were able to figure out Paul's master plan for meeting places. Now, there was an FBI agent, Tony Nelson, important character in this story, a protagonist, and he was one of the cops doing surveillance. Now, Tony Nelson looked every bit like a cop with his little 1970s mustache. He had to either be a cop or a porno actor from the 70s, I swear to God. And the way he dressed with his button-up shirt, business attire. Now, Tony's friend, whom he started comparing notes with, was the famous Kenny Mccabe I talked about last episode. It was unusual for an FBI agent and an NYPD detective to work so closely together. It's even problematic these days, the rivalries between the two. And it was then as well. And that's because the NYPD and FBI were always competing to get the bad guys and win the publicity, which made getting the bad guys even harder and gave organized crime an advantage. But Detective Kenny Mccabe and FBI agent Tony Nelson were wiser than that. Now, as I told you last episode, Detective Kenny Mccabe was this tall, heavy-set former basketball player who worked for the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office. Both Nelson and Kenny had been paying this informant for information that they later learned he had been telling both of them the exact same information. So when they met up one night where the informant was supposed to be, there must have been some mix-up that the snitch made. They realized they were being fleeced. So they stiffed the informant and shared what they knew. And from there they became friends and allies. Tony and Mccabe became such close friends and allies that they'd go on surveillance missions over to veterans and friends together, like partners, even though they worked in totally different departments. Kenny was doing mob surveillance more often than Nelson, but they both were quite committed. And you'd think veterans and friends was Kenny Mccabe's favorite hangout if you happen to spot his odd-looking Pinto with its weird colors. So Nelson and Mccabe were among the first, and probably the first, police to show up at the Veterans and Friends, and like a bee to honey. When Kenny went alone, he oftentimes didn't even try to hide his presence. Kenny wanted the mob to see his orange and blue car,
to know that it was only a matter of time before he pinched them for good. Maybe it'd even make getting some of them to squeal easier when the cops finally did make the big move. Kenny drove a battered blue Pinto with a yellow hood, and it was kind of silly looking. He loved his car. It was different. He didn't care what people thought of it. He didn't need a fancy Cadillac that looked like every fancy Cadillac, such as the ones that the mobster conformist, always obsessed with image, often drove. Now, one night, Roy was standing across the street from Veterans and Friends, and he was on the sidewalk chatting away with another mobster. He was probably dressed like he usually was dressed at Veterans and Friends, which were in chinos and a threaded shirt. He wanted to look as casual as possible, and not somebody who appeared to be going to a business job, nor like the younger guys who looked like they were about ready to bust a move suddenly on the dance floor that was the dirty New York City sidewalk. Now, Nelson and Mccabe had already heard of Roy. Word of Roy got around. Supposedly he was a ruthless murderer who liked chopping up his victims into hamburger Happy Meals, like some deranged butcher. But it was probably bullshit, like a lot of other stories they heard from informants. Rumors. Not necessarily because the informants were lying, but just because they believed something really stupid that they heard. Still, the cops managed to connect Nino and Roy as guys working together, and possibly Gambinos. That's when Roy spotted Mccabe. His eyes drew back in exasperation. He glowered, reached down and seized his crotch like Kenny was trying to steal it, and then thrust his hips forward in an obscene gesture. "Suck my cock!" Kenny Mccabe declined Roy's generous offer. Instead, he smiled and said, "Suck yourself, asshole." And thus began Roy's very unhealthy and emotionally abusive relationship with law enforcement. Now, except for the stresses from law enforcement and other authorities, Roy's life was overall extremely good during this period. He threw lavish firework displays like he did every 4th of July. He loved showing off to everybody else. He had his fun barbecues, which the crew and his family got together and enjoyed. Chris, Borelli, the twins, Freddie, all of them would be there. Roy was an outdoor enthusiast. Every summer he'd go camping. Now, one year, Roy was acting like the good man I think he would have been more fully developed into without a horribly neurotic mom and absent judgmental father. And that year, during the summer, he helped a homeless veteran named Russ. See, Roy was upstate. He was with Albert and Uncle Joey. Now, this Russ was suffering from PTSD. He was a Vietnam vet. He was living in a tent on a piece of land he had purchased from the money he got while fighting overseas. Roy saw the outsider in Russ, the type of person that Roy had once been when he was being picked on a lot. And he, Uncle Joey, and Albert built a cabin for the poor guy. Now, if it was all about just staying on his land, well, they could have probably just bribed him if they wanted to camp on his land without inconvenience. But Roy did something a lot more helpful for Russ than just money. And later, when Roy and his companions were camping on Russ's land one night, some idiots fired a gun at Russ's direction on his land, wanting to discourage him from living there so that they could have the whole territory to themselves. Roy became pissed, both because somebody fired in his direction and for Russ. So he went and collected a bunch of semi-automatics and an endless supply of ammunition. These included at least one MAC-10. He then instructed Albert to go and position himself and begin firing when he did. So when they heard a gunshot again, like Rambo, Roy stood up and began emptying his gun and reloading. Well, that seemed to do the trick, because a frightened voice called back, "Is anybody dead down there?" It's funny how guns can suddenly make even the most smug bully quiver and become more modest. Roy furiously said, "No, but you will be if you keep fucking around." And that was the end of it. And Russ probably wasn't bothered again after that either. Now, I really love this idea of Roy, this good side, that Albert DeMeo recalled in his book For the Sins of My Father. And I want to really believe that it was a sincere part of Roy. A Roy that he might have been had he not become so damaged
And maybe he really did care about this Russ. He had a track record of caring about outsiders, Freddie, Chris, so forth. If so, it makes him more interesting. But when it comes to the mask of sanity, a concept that's pretty basic to forensic psychologists, the idea that sociopaths and psychopaths act nice to hide the more sinister nature they might have. You've heard it before. Oh, he seems so nice after some horrific crime was committed by some guy who turned out to be very disturbed. So it makes knowing who the real Roy was a little complicated. And maybe this was more of an act. Or maybe even Roy had a self-interest involved in building this cabin for Russ. After all, he had these escape hiding places in case he ever needed to go on the lam. It could be because of altruistic reasons and self-interest. Oftentimes, everybody usually makes a decision based on multiple reasons and not just one. However, let's assume that this side of Roy is really sincere. This was his greatest tragedy, all right, his damaged self. That he wasn't fully more this Roy, the sympathetic and heroic Roy. Now, the pain that he would bring on himself later, those sorrows would be a result of his own terrible evils. And I don't feel sorry for him there. I'll reserve that sympathy for his more innocent victims. But I'll always wish that he had become more of this good Roy, that I think he would have been if Chubby had raised him, or some other positive parental influence. Roy owned a Winnebago, and often during these camping trips, Roy started bringing his crew along. Chris was the first to come to his barbecues, and more than likely, he was also the first to come to his camping trips, since Roy kind of adopted him into the family. Now, it wasn't clear when he started these camping trips, so I can't say for sure. But either way, eventually he started bringing along the rest of the crew, including the twins, Joey and Anthony, two people whose backgrounds I'm going to mention in much more detail in the near future. Now, in 1977, Roy, his son, and Thugs had a particularly memorable summer, and that's when you see all those photos of Roy holding that rifle. Those are 1977 pictures. You can see he was in better shape. He was chubby, he wasn't skinny, but he was in better shape than he would be later on when he had lost control of his weight. So he was probably feeling particularly confident and good that year. He just got made. He just stole all those papers from the Quinn business, which was going to make his own already lucrative auto theft business skyrocket. Nobody would fuck with him. Yeah, he was doing great. Now it isn't hard to imagine his group of vicious killers in back of the Winnebago, drinking, cracking jokes, gossiping about who they had sex with or whatever. Anthony and Joey were great with women, so was Henry, and they'd sleep with models and waitresses and everything they could get their hands on that was beautiful, and women liked them. And they probably were listening to music with their headphones on as they stared out at the farms and pastures of grazing cows, which probably got dull after a while. But in those Winnebagos, you often had a mounted TV, a radio, and audiobooks on tapes, or the regular kind if you like to read books, something I can only imagine Roy, Henry, Albert, and Chris probably enjoyed, maybe Dominic if he ever came along. I can't see the Gemini twins as avid readers. They weren't the most intellectual or imaginative bunch, but that's only a guess. And when I talk about the Gemini twins, well, they really were like a cross between Patrick Bateman from American Psycho mixed with Scarface, mixed with Beavis and Butthead. And so after a while, these childish men were probably even rowdier and more impatient than ever to get where they were going. Though not so impatient that they wouldn't care about pissing off Roy. Everybody understood who the boss was. Now, it's an interesting aspect of Roy's character with all his flaws that, according to Sins of My Father, written by his son Albert DeMeo, an account that I believe, Roy didn't really ever show any evidence of wanting to harm animals, at least that Albert ever noticed. On these trips, he didn't really go hunting. They went there to practice their firepower. They'd bring along an entire arsenal to impress a platoon, but it was all for firing ranges. His son, Albert, said he even liked animals. He shot a squirrel one year that he thought was rabid, but in general that was pretty rare. That was at the behest of his neurotic mom, who was insisting that it was rabid. That he liked animals, along with his occasional compassion for outsiders that even normal people often didn't show, and his patience in never showing violence around his kids and his wife, presumably, was probably his best defense against any claims he was really a psychopath or a sociopath, that it was mob culture influencing him. But those aren't great defenses. Again, psychopathy and sociopathy are on a spectrum. On top of that, this could have been a mask of sanity, meaning he took no real pleasure in hurting animals anymore, if he ever did, and he didn't want to be seen as violent because he liked hurting people instead. And during a period when he was racking up a kill count, in which he was personally, by the end of it, suspected of something between 50 something and 70 something victims by his hand alone, and his crew of over 200. Well, it makes sense that he wouldn't want to bring attention to himself. But he also showed real empathy for a frog once, and he was in tears over it. I'll get to that story in the near future. So maybe Roy was really like Tony Soprano in The Sopranos, and he actually did have real empathy for animals. It's possible. I think he did. Humans are a lot more complex than forensic psychologists, particularly the ones you see interviewed in the newspapers, would like to believe. Now, there was one time an animal got hurt, but not due to Roy. That's because his crew, particularly the twins, thought it would be gangster to shoot a cow while they were off alone among the farms. And then they laughed and came back boasting, "We whacked the cow!" And they were surprised when Roy's face transformed into fury. "Do you want to go to jail over a fucking cow?" Roy trudged over to the farm where the dead cow was, and police had already arrived. "Look, I'm really sorry about what happened. Those guys are idiots. They've never been hunting before. I'm not even sure they know what a cow is. I don't want any trouble. What's the cow worth?" Roy quickly explained. Sure, it was probably the stupidest explanation on the planet, but what was he supposed to say? There really is no good explanation for what they did. At least it wasn't somebody's pet. Then he pulled a wallet thick with Benjamins from his pocket and gave the farmer enough money to drop the matter. Money was explanation enough, like it is for most things. Now it's time to leave the sunny pastures of those farmlands and forests and whisk back to the dismal crime-ridden streets of New York City. It's August 10th. The New York City blackout had occurred a month ago, and parts of the city had been razed due to rioters. And during this period, a sexually frustrated David Berkowitz continued to terrorize New York City. Then, finally, as a result of a stupid mistake, the attention-starved serial killer was arrested and brought in for questioning by the tough Irish detective you've already heard about, Joe Coffey, a man whose family had grown up terrorized by Irish organized crime when he was just a little kid. And again, Joe Coffey, as I said in a few episodes ago, would play an important role in later bringing down the DeMeo crew in the Westies.
It's one terrific bowl of soup.
The arrest of suspect David Berkowitz.
Jane, the man's name is David Berkowitz. He is an unmarried 24-year-old postal worker. He's a veteran of Korean service with the United States Army. When he was arrested late last night in his apartment in Yonkers, New York, he told the officers, "Okay, you've got me." David Berkowitz is expected to be booked, as Jane mentioned, in Brooklyn this morning and formally accused of committing at least one of 6 murders in the New York area in just the past year. Specifically, they expect him to be booked for the murder of 20-year-old Stacy Moskowitz on July the 31st. In the end, a parking ticket proved to be the undoing for Berkowitz. Here's Robert Hager with more of the story.
This is the man police believe to be the son of Sam, the .44 caliber killer who has killed 6 and wounded 7 in a string of attacks over.
The streets might have been safe again from the can't-get-no-love David Berkowitz, but homicide and theft were only going to go up. And crime would continue to grow as a problem for the next 15 years, with the criminals themselves oftentimes being the greatest number of victims. Now, the following includes some issues that arose out of an acrimonious dispute between real-life Lucchese mobster Pete LaFrocia, who's obviously a figure in this series, and Detective Windling, whom I contacted for an interview. I wasn't trying to get these two to attack each other. I like Pete from what I've seen, and I'd like to see him have a happy life, prison-free now that he's free, and I respect Detective Windling's police work. I spoke to them as a neutral party member with a self-imposed fiduciary duty to keep anything private they don't want talked about that they say. So if something slips, they say, hey, would you not talk about this? Okay. And the only exceptions to that would be something that doesn't apply here, like sex crimes, crimes against children, somebody doing life or serious time because of a crime that you committed, or murdering innocent civilians. And most of the DeMeo victims weren't innocent. And that's a code of ethics I actually maintain with other people who know a lot about DeMeo, who I spoke to, whom I can't even name. So Windling didn't want to talk to me, but he told me some information about Pete, including some cold case facts. Windling and Pete do not get along. Windling hates Pete. Windling was kind of like Roy's arch nemesis along with Mccabe. And Windling was also kind of like Pete's arch nemesis. Windling always saw him as the guy who got away. Now, I'm only going to include the information that Windling gave me concerning the DeMeo case. Any other investigations that Pete was involved with for other crews, I'm not going to talk about because they're not pertinent to Roy. And again, I'm going to rephrase very carefully and decode anything that Pete says because he's hard to understand for a lot of people, and include that as Pete's defense in next episode. So you can hear it from the link below, or you'll be able to hear it again from me if you have trouble understanding it. So the following narrative comes from Capici, Montiglio, and Detective Windling, and this is their claim of what happened. Daniel Conte was another Brooklyn native and a Canarsie junkyard graduate with a long-time career as a criminal. He had 10 arrests. He married into the Pete LaFrocia family and became Pete's brother-in-law. He brazenly drove a stolen car as his own, and he joined the Pete Grillo and DeMeo band of thieves. When Conte and his partner Costello tried to hijack a shipment and failed, authorities were alerted, and presumably at least a few arrests, including Conte and Costello, his partner, were made. Conte was quickly released, and that's a sign that he probably snitched. And Roy and Pete correctly guessed that Conte was a snitch. Pete called his brother that day that he was last seen Conte, and when Conte went to meet his brother-in-law one day for a bite to eat, that was the last anybody saw him alive, going to meet Pete. A few days later, some unrelated car thieves were stripping Conte's stolen car in Brooklyn and found his putrid corpse in the trunk when they popped it. And they immediately alerted the cops. They were thieves, but they weren't killers, which is kind of noble for car thieves. I gotta respect them on that as much as I hate car thieves. 2 weeks later, John Costello was found shot and killed, his partner. Roy was declaring war on snitches that summer after Katz and Quinn tried to snitch, and he'd kill you on the least suspicion now. Don't snitch was the first rule of being part of the DeMeo Club, and they didn't want guys with big mouths either. In fact, Roy would keep his crew anxious by having multiple weekly shape-up meetings now at the clubhouse in back of the Gemini, where his cousin Joey, aka Dracula, recently moved in and became part of the crew. And everyone going there, the Gemini twins, Borelli, Grillo, not Dominic, but the rest of them, Pete, never knew for absolute sure if Roy was going to turn on them and whack him. So Joseph Guilmo, whom was also nicknamed Dracula, was a cousin of Roy, and there's very little that's known about his background, very little that even his extended family seemed to know about his background. I'm going to call Joseph Dracula because it's easier to pronounce than his last name, and that's the name everybody remembers him as anyway, his nickname. He was called Dracula because he looked like Bela Lugosi to some of the crew members. Now, Capici and Murder Machine also suggest that he might have additionally earned that name because he licked blood of the victims, an allegation Joe Coffey makes in his book, The Coffey Files, about Roy DeMeo. And that came from Vito Arena's claims during the interrogation. Wouldn't surprise me if these guys did lick blood sometimes, since they got carried away doing other, even more morbid things to the bodies in much more brutal ways while clowning around. Once you start to dehumanize the corpses and dehumanize the people they were, well, anything goes. Now, Dracula was originally a bank robber who had done hard time after being nabbed, in which he had done something incompetently. And there are two different accounts of how he was arrested. Albert says, and this is what Roy told him as a kid, that Dracula dressed up like a woman and robbed a bank. And while he was escaping, he was wearing a wig, lipstick, and dress. He flipped the car, climbed out of the car, and began running, ripping off the wig and the dress, and was then caught still wearing lipstick after he had ripped off the dress and the wig, and was confused why the cops fingered him out. Now, of the two stories, I think this one's bunk. I think that Roy had a juvenile sense of humor, something I can relate to, and he would tell Albert these ridiculous stories, and Albert would just believe them because he was a kid and he'd believe anything. The alternative story, which is more believable, was that Dracula got caught as a getaway driver because he couldn't drive a stick shift. In either event, Dracula was no criminal mastermind, and we know that he was a felon who committed bank robbery and did a long stretch of time. He also was at least 60 and very influenced by Roy. So Dracula was living in the clubhouse by 77, which Roy owned, and in which Roy told Albert he was living there because he was too incompetent to live on his own, but in reality the truth was much more diabolical. Dracula, who most of the crew saw as gentle and harmless at first, had a telephone hooked up to the bar at the Gemini Lounge. He could contact Roy at any point from the Gemini Lounge to his apartment. His apartment was also sparsely furnished. This guy didn't seem to be interested in anything, no art, nothing. There was a mattress there, a few pieces of furniture, cookingware, and a collection of sex toys. Most people presumed he must have been using those sex toys, but it could have just been a collection since he got them for free from Roy's brothel strip clubs, like the one that sold sex toys in New Jersey. And some of the other members and Roy's friends, and probably Roy himself, would oftentimes have sex on his mattress, so technically the sex toys could have been for other guys too. And during shape-up nights, or on some nights when they had just murdered somebody, he'd make pasta for them while they were busy preparing the body for disposal. You'd think the Gemini was purely a slaughterhouse when I talk about it, but it was actually a fun place there on nights most of the time. There was a comedian, Gino Durante, who performed on stage sometimes when musicians weren't there. Now, this guy was a lifelong Brooklyn native. He used to be a bartender who'd let little 12-year-old Roy DeMeo come into his bar and have beers when he'd smash his little plump face against the glass, looking inside longingly like a puppy dog, wanting to come in to drink. And he'd say, "Okay, come on in, kid." And the opening act was probably really funny because Gino would crack jokes and he'd do a lot of improv. And he'd invite Roy to climb up on stage and be the straight man. So he's the serious straight man, not quite sure what to do. Bet you that was fucking hilarious, too. I bet you Roy was really a fun guy to be around when he was in a good mood. Not trying to outdo Jason Voorhees as a mass murderer. Ruby Stein, Splain, Sherry, Quinn, Hofaker, Costello, and Conte were just some of the victims of the DeMeo crew murdered in 1977, one or a few of which was done without Roy's permission. But the DeMeo crew were suspected of a lot more. These were just victims who simply vanished through their ritualistic murder method that I'm going to detail very carefully next episode. And that became known, obviously, as the Gemini method to many of you who are familiar with DeMeo. And it was one of the most effective murder and body disposal strategies that any American killer has ever imagined. So Roy was selling illegal guns out of the Gemini Lounge. He was selling coke out of the Gemini Lounge. It was mostly Chris was selling marijuana, which they were bringing in by bushels. And as far as the coke, well, he had to have guys go down to Miami to buy that and bring it back. Henry Brelli would oftentimes go to Miami. Henry started out as kind of his accountant, but he became increasingly more of his drug handler in terms of going and getting the supplies. Henry actually shows up in the book American Desperado, which is about the cocaine cowboys in Florida. It's a book that I'm a little dubious of some of the details. Now, Henry was obviously a very bad guy. Under Roy, probably a bad guy in general. But In that book, Henry is portrayed to be a complete psychopath and cartoonishly evil, like he'll just blow away one of the guys with him for nothing. And that seems a little bit exaggerated. However, I'm not making any judgments until I go and reread it again, and I'm not going to be talking about that book until I get to the 1980s. So Henry, and oftentimes the others too, would go down to Florida, especially Miami. They would pick up cocaine, they'd bring it back, Roy would sell it at the Gemini Lounge, and what was left over would go up Burley and the twins and Chris's nose. Now, I learned recently from someone I can't say, but they would know, it's somebody extremely close to Roy, that Roy had a cocaine problem when he was younger, and later on he would have a cocaine problem, which is supported by Sammy the Bull's book, and he might have been doing cocaine during this period and keeping it secret from Nino, but this is coming from a person who would know. New York Crime Spot and Roderick Molina, know who I'm talking about, but they've been sworn to secrecy. Now, Roy and Nino were also making money off one of the mob's oldest businesses, the sex industry. If you are familiar with Al Capone, he was, as much as anything, a pimp. So Roy and Nino were making money from smut through squeezing other porn dealers, selling their own bootleg porn, owning investments in strip clubs, and prostitution, and their prostitutes were also usually strippers at their strip club. It's hard for me to imagine Nino being invested in one of those vices because, funny enough, he was romantic with eyes only for his wife Rose and would start missing her right away whenever he was in prison. But anyhow, Nino and Roy had invested in at least one New Jersey strip club. I'm sure they invested in additional ones, but I'm still researching the details on that. And this one was called Plato's Retreat, which is very unoriginal and not to be confused with the two others in New York City, which were infamous swinger sex clubs and prostitution dens. And those were ones that I know Ron Jeremy used to frequent. He'd boast about all the wives he'd sleep with when they saw it was Ron Jeremy. This strip club was basically also a sex club, brothel, and it was a place to deal drugs. It's basically Vice Paradise for New Jersey. And it was located in Bricktown. I don't know where that is. Maybe one of you guys do. It had a massage parlor, adult bookstores, heart-shaped bathtubs, hot tubs, safety deposit boxes. You could pay credit card, but there was a $5 service charge. It was also a strip club, a massage parlor, and it sold sex toys. And the strippers were also prostitutes. So this place was Disneyland for sex addicts. And Roy, who never met a barmaid he didn't want to bend over, must have been like a fat kid with an eating disorder at Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. This business opened in '75, but it was doomed within another decade anyway, because the reason why all this licentiousness so ubiquitous in the '70s, but not the '80s, wasn't just because the moral backlash during the Reagan era. It's also when AIDS would creep about, and suddenly horny couples and guys who like to sleep with everything they could weren't as keen to find places crawling with STDs and go on a sex spree. And if you're wondering how even a mob boss like Roy DeMeo afforded a place with all of this stuff, the answer is he didn't. There were at least 17 other guys invested in Plato's Retreat in New Jersey, one of which would eventually order another one of them murdered. I'm not sure who did it, so it wouldn't surprise me if there's another Roy DeMeo victim we don't know about. Now, you might recall, although it was probably a long time ago for you, that Roy and Nino started investing in the smut industry in 1972. And that was the same year they extorted Paul Rothenberg, who later became Roy's first murder victim. Well, by now they had extorted, bullied, and sometimes murdered about 8 men in the smut industry. Since New York City made porn illegal, except to watch in adult entertainment theaters where you couldn't legally wank to it, buying bootleg porn was very lucrative. I remember estimating with an inflation adjustment calculator in episode 1 that Rothenberg was pulling in tens of millions of dollars a year. That is, him and his partner. So we're talking some serious money here. Nino and Roy made a lot of money from smut, but neither of them ever came close to becoming one of the bigger earners from it. The biggest earner among the Gambinos, among the Mafia period, when it came to sleaze earning, was Robert D.B. DeBernardo, and he was probably the biggest smut peddler in America. D.B. DeBernardo originally worked for the Conte family in New Jersey. That's the infamous family that was the inspiration for The Sopranos, the New Jersey crime family. But he was permitted to join the Gambinos after a negotiation, and he brought with him his partner, Reuben Sturman, who was also one of the biggest porn dealers in America at that time. Now, when I say partner, I'm using that term broadly. After all, I'm not sure if Reuben was working for Robert, or working with Robert, or being extorted by Robert. It's kind of hard to tell when you're talking about mobsters and civilians. But in any event, they were both very successful with dealing porn. DB worked for Gaggi, and he was unusual as a mob boss for several reasons. He didn't have a crew, so that meant he didn't have a captain to answer to, and he had minions, muscle, whatever you want to call them, but they weren't quite as organized as your typical crew. I don't know why somebody wouldn't want a crew, other than not wanting a capo. Seems like one of the perks. You could have your crew who answer to you, but whatever, he had muscles, so it's not like people weren't listening to him and weren't taking orders. He could easily have somebody killed. Now, DB was also unusual in that he didn't murder anybody to get in, as far as the authorities know. He got into the mob purely on his earning potential. That might make him seem a little bit more benevolent than other mobsters, but when you study DB, you really should realize, if you're not morally vacant, that it's a really evil organization, because this guy was as big a piece of crap as they come. Why do I say that? Well, not because he's dealing regular porn, but because he was also dealing child porn. He just wasn't happy and content with making millions from regular porn. The child porn was coming from the Netherlands and Denmark. There was a large connection going there. And so it would go right into DB's hands. And his guys were selling it too. So this wasn't as rare as you would like to think. And he started dealing so much child porn that eventually New Yorkers became horrified because they noticed people dealing it on the street openly. Can you imagine that? I'd want to fucking kill somebody. It's disgusting and revolting, but it does show you exactly how bad some of these people were. I'm pretty sure that Roy was dealing child porn. There were a lot of people he worked with who were dealing child porn underneath DB, and he worked in those areas. But I'm still researching the details. If Roy was dealing it, he was dealing it because he was obsessed with getting more power, not because I think he had any particular ill will towards kids. She seems to have been pretty good with. But that really wouldn't make him much better now, would it? It wouldn't make him better at all, because it just shows how morally compromised he always was when it came to his own self-interest, and he was willing to exploit children in the worst way possible over it, presuming that account's true. Also, if it is true, it would be interesting to learn more about his relationship with DB or any of his men. I'm curious if that's where he was getting it from. Hopefully somebody was prosecuted out of that. During the span of his criminal career, Roy extorted 8 other porn dealers, several of which he murdered. Among his early victims were Paul Rothenberg and Tony Argrilla. Then there was Brackelli. You remember him from episode 5, I hope, the maid guy who punched Roy. He was a porn dealer, and he was also murdered. Now, I don't know all the rest, but I do know one of them. That was Richard Kuklinski, the wannabe mob hitman. He was telling the truth about being beat up by Roy and being a porn developer. The following interview comes from Frank Pergola of the NYPD's 12th Homicide Zone Squad He was a very important investigator in the bringing down of the Roy DeMeo crew. He was very, very intimately aware of the players in that crew. His part is heavily covered in Murder Machine, and he first appears on page 209, and he'll be appearing later on in this series.
And our question to them was, who in organized crime did he hit? There wasn't anybody. Everybody that he hit, or they indicted him for murdering in Jersey, was an adversary of his or somebody he was robbing. And they weren't wise guys. So how did they portray him as this? I got called into HBO and they wanted to know from me if this guy was involved with Roy DeMeo. I says no. And they said no, he was. And I said no, he ain't. You're perpetrating a farce on the public.
Right.
You know. But they said no, he's an organized crime guy. He was involved with Roy DeMeo. According to the FBI, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and everybody else that we know, this guy Kuklinski had nothing to do with anybody in organized crime. In fact, he was an extortion victim of Roy DeMeo, who was trying to overtake the pornography industry in New York and New Jersey. And Roy and his crew committed like 7 or 8 homicides involved in taking over the pornography industry. And this guy was one of them.
Not a homicide, obviously, since Richard was still alive at this time. This is 2002. But he was a kind of casualty of the fight in which Roy was taking over, different distributors that might be competition. The following comes from Agent Dominic Polifrone, a call that we had, as well as Pete LaFrocia, who was a mid-level Roy DeMeo henchman, and Doug, aka Irish Luck. And as well as the previous interview, Dominic Polifrone was very candid. He seems like an honest and genuinely great guy. This was the guy who did the undercover work and arrested Richard Kuklinski. He's the guy who really took him down. I consider him a hero. And one thing before I begin. People always ask, well, if he wasn't a hitman, how'd he make all that money? Because apparently those are the only choices, mafia hitman or no money. In the 1970s in New York City, porn's illegal to personally own. You have your porn theaters, but they're disgusting, dangerous, and dirty places where people do a lot worse than just wank. And the cops go into those theaters all the time back then to try and spot somebody masturbating so they can arrest them. That was the end of Paul Rubin's career, Pee Wee Herman. So a lot of people don't want to go to wank theaters and have some cop trying to watch and see if they're jerking off. And following the rules defeats the whole purpose. So the best option then is to find a smut peddler. And New York City back then was full of smut peddlers. Now, the reason why dealing bootleg porn was so lucrative in New York then is a matter of simple supply and demand. Because it was illegal to own, and you could only see it in a seedy theater that puts you in an uneasy and sticky situation, both literally and figuratively, with those around you. Makes it hardly the type of place to go find relief for yourself for most people. And on top of that, this is the decade of Super 8, otherwise known as 8mm film. Those aren't as easy to tape and record as the VHS would be in the 1980s. You needed guys to find them, develop them, and sell them. Richard Kuklinski was an enormous volatile sociopath who made hundreds of thousands of dollars illegally developing porn and Disney films and bootlegging them to the public. There you go. Paul Rothenberg was pulling in far more. Kuklinski was among the 8 people whom was strong-armed by Roy in his obsession to make more money for Nino. He had to be cautious and prey on the vulnerable bootleggers, because many of these illegal porn dealers in Manhattan and New Jersey at the time were connected. To give you an example of how surgical Roy had to be if he was going to get his foot in the door, well, you recall Brocchini's story in which he had a feud with Brocchini, and in that incident, Roy had to wait months before he responded after getting punched because that guy was a made guy. He didn't want those kind of conflicts, obviously. They were at a major risk for him if anybody found out he was killing mobsters. And he didn't want to infuriate other mob bosses. So he had to be very specific on who he preyed on. Because illegal porn was a big business and the mob was getting involved. And you can see from previous newspaper accounts about the mob's involvement that I usually leave in the credits. So Kuklinski didn't have any protection. He was never a Cosa Nostra associate, and I'm not going to give you any more details than I'm confident stating about my basic broad understanding of the interaction. But here's what happened. Roy demanded a large cut of Kuklinski's profits when he learned about him, like he did with Paul Rothenberg, whom Richard may or may not have associated with or worked for. He claims he did. I don't know, since he was a pathological liar. But he definitely had some connections in the porn industry. Kuklinski, when Roy approached him, mouthed off to him. Roy warned him, and then later confronted him with his crew. I don't know if the details in Iceman's book are correct about that, because I neither trust the author nor Richard to tell the details correctly, because he's always trying to self-aggrandize himself. But Roy did beat up Richard very severely, and he probably even knocked a few of his teeth loose. He was pistol whipped repeatedly. Both Pete, who was very close to Anthony Center and still probably knows him, and who worked with the twins for years, and Dominic Polifrone said Richard was pistol whipped. Richard was a pathological liar and liked trolling, probably even considered it harmless when he was boasting on HBO. You might notice his expression becomes a lot more somber and seems more legitimate when he starts talking about being beaten up by Roy. Eventually, Richard was ordered to stop producing by DeMeo, and with a wounded ego, he went on to pursue other illicit activities.
Of the 5 confirmed murders, the Rodney Dangerfield of killers, Richard Can't Get No Respect, Kuklinski, murdered George Malaband in 1980 over tapes, presumably porn tapes. Malaband had 27,000. Richard said he was going to sell him 27,000 of tapes, and then he shot and killed George Malaband and just took the 27,000. He then put George Malaband in a barrel and left him at the side of the road. Then came Louis Masgay, who was murdered over $95,000. Richard offered him $95,000 in video cassettes and then betrayed him and just shot and killed him and took the $95,000. And that's the guy who was responsible for Richard getting his named. He put Masgay on ice for several years, and the police were able to figure out that the guy had been frozen because of ice crystals and his corpse. So Richard should have probably hidden that guy a little bit better. Then a year later, he murdered Paul Hoffman, and that was because Paul Hoffman was looking to buy this drug Tagamet. He was a 51-year-old pharmacist, not a bad guy necessarily. He was just looking to get a drug cheap, and Richard said he had it, met with him,
and murdered the 51-year-old pharmacist. Kuklinski then started a burglary ring. Now we're talking 82 to 83, and after numerous burglaries, one of his henchmen was arrested and decided to snitch on Richard, and so the rest of the Kuklinski crew, which included Kuklinski, Daniel Deppner, and Gary Smith as the 3 remaining ones, decided to hide out and remain low while the investigation was going on, and they hid out at a motel in Bergdon, New Jersey. Gary Smith talked about maybe going straight during this period, so Richard, fearing he was going to flip, fed him a cyanide-laced burger. Will Deppner came up behind and strangled him. Now this was stupid because the cyanide itself would have killed him, and now he left marks, so everybody knows the guy was killed. Cyanide takes several minutes, and depending on various factors like weight and the dose, well, that's how long it's going to take. You can calculate how long it will take to kill the guy. But Richard, Mr. Impulsive Criminal Mastermind Kuklinski, didn't take that into account. Gary Smith was later found rotting underneath the mattress in their hotel room, which is also not exactly a methodical way for this ultra-brilliant hitman to dispose of a corpse. Now, Richard's daughter Merrick was getting married, and Richard had the spare keys to her fiancé's apartment. The fiancé wasn't home, so Richard and Deppner decided to hide out there next. And over the course of several months, Richard used cyanide and brutal methods to kill Deppner so he wouldn't talk. Richard then disposed of Deppner's body by leaving it in the middle of public, where pedestrians spotted a bunch of vultures feeding on it. Richard then snitched on himself by boasting to an associate that he murdered these people, and the associate went and told the authorities. And on top of that, Richard was the last person seen alive with the victims, so it wasn't hard to put together, even if it was a long and drawn-out investigation. And the guy was still dangerous, don't get me wrong, but he didn't work for DeMeo, whose rules included no body, no crime, and don't talk to people. Who was Mr. Softy, and how did Kuklinski get the cyanide? Prongay, a.k.a. Mr. Softy, he worked as Mr. Softy, was real. He wasn't a hitman. Mr. Softy refrigerators weren't even large enough to store corpses. He was, however, a highly volatile friend of Richard's, might have been even more dangerous than Richard himself. He was paranoid, possibly a political extremist, tried to murder his wife and son John by running over them with a car. He also blew off his wife's door. He had chemistry knowledge, and he's likely where Richard got cyanide. Not because just having a few years of chemistry is going to automatically make you know how to do cyanide, but Richard said that he had some books that taught him how to make it. Richard didn't know the names of the books and didn't have them. That's why he started asking around about how to make cyanide and how he eventually got pinched. Those books might have been the Anarchist Cookbook, and I don't know how accurate the formula for cyanide is in that, or the allegedly much more accurate Poor Man's James Bond, which I do own, but not because I want to use it. That would be A, a felony, and B, there's no reason why I would, because there's nobody I'm looking to hurt. However, since I'm interested in criminology and criminal justice, knowing what's out there is extremely useful in figuring out crimes and how somebody might have gotten a hold of some unusual knowledge. And these books were connected to a lot of high-profile crimes. The Poor Man's James Bond was a popular book back in the 1970s among political extremists. It's very believable that somebody like that would have gotten access to it. And I think Richard and Prongay eventually got into a dispute in which Richard shot him in the head in his garage. And it's not really because Richard was more dangerous or Prongay was more dangerous in that case. It's just whoever happens to have a gun on him when the other one talks shit first. Richard, ironically, might have been induced to murder by Roy, but not in the way he would have preferred. By beating up and humiliating a narcissist like Richard, might have made him more unbalanced, irritable, and eager to turn on his victims whenever he was doing business. But if he were the killer he'd like to have been, he would have been able to take Roy out. And eventually, through his own blundering, Richard was apprehended. Now, I think he killed just a total of 5 to 6 people. I think he would have admitted to it and eagerly confessed if he had killed more, since he was already doing life. And there's an element of the public who respects a killer who kills a lot of people. Dominic Polifrone, the agent, he said that there were people upset that he even arrested this guy, and that some of his fans are like a cult, and I agree with him. Dominic Polifrone thinks he killed up to 11. He knows information I don't know, so maybe he's right. HBO eventually had the rug pulled out from under them, but he's big money, so they just go where the money's at, not necessarily what's the best journalism, and so do other news sources, although a couple accurately reported it. Nevertheless, he was very dangerous, he was going to keep killing, and it doesn't make Dominic Polifrone any less of a hero for stopping this asshole. Now it's time to return back to Roy DeMeo and the fall of 1977. Not much more would happen in 1977, at least not among the details that are public. Albert DeMeo turned 11. 11's a special year in the family of the DeMeos. It's the age in which the child is confirmed into the religion, becomes a man in the eyes of the Lord, although he's still just a little kid to everybody else. But Albert must have felt much closer to being a man then, maybe even felt like a man. And a celebration was held with a big meal. Now, besides eating that lavish food and making the day about Albert, he received 2 books, 2 very different books, from his mom and dad. His mom gave him a Good News Bible. She was very religious, and she wanted to continue to make sure that Albert was very religious. And Albert loved his Bible, his Good News Bible. Then he was also given a book from his dad, Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince, which Albert didn't know much about. And those 2 philosophies couldn't be any different. One is supposed to be about faith and spiritual matters, and the other one is much more of a dog-eat-dog world in which You're struggling for power and to survive. Throughout his whole life, both his mom and pops had made sure that Albert went to church every Sunday and that he did well in school, and that's something that both parents supported. Roy and Gladys considered Catholicism and education to be excellent foundations for morals. Although neither parent attended church too much, Roy himself rarely attended church at all. He'd even tell his son that he knew exactly where he was going, and that was to hell. But at least he wasn't going to be a hypocrite about it. Although Roy didn't know it at the time, he was giving Albert the ingredients to become a very depressed, sad, and anxious boy, because he was always worried about whether his father would die as he learned more about his work, and whether his dad was going to go to hell or not. It'd get eventually to the point that he'd start flipping a coin every day to see if his dad would return. At that time, though, it hadn't quite hit him. And speaking of the holidays, Halloween came around. The kids would get together. They'd have apple cider and apple dunking, and Roy would, in the dark, tell scary stories. And it would freak Albert out a little bit because he didn't seem like his dad in that darkness while he was telling those stories. Then Christmas came, and as usual, the DeMeos held lavish Christmas parties in which the crew were invited, and Christmas songs would be played through loudspeakers onto the roads outside for their neighbors. Decorations were hung everywhere. Now once a thief stole some Christmas bulbs, and Roy became really angry at that. But after he investigated it, it seemed like the thief must have known Santa, because they were delivered quickly back to the house in no time. And an apology note was left. Roy must have been a truly unusual guy, his son probably thought, to instill the spirit of Christmas generosity even in thieves. Early in 1978, another dismembered Westies victim would come to the attention of the police and the media, and Paul would demand a sit-down with the Westies. He didn't want people he was associating with acting like crazy, impulsive psychos, ironically enough. Paul was apparently oblivious to what Roy was doing during this period, or that Westies victim was partially as a result of Roy urging Jimmy Coonan to break Mickey in when it came to dismemberment. The cops were going to turn their attention to Patty Testa, Pete, and Roy, but that's for next episode. In the meantime, Roy was enormously happy with his success and power. The Gambino crime family had around 25 crews, but none of them were as strong as the small army of vicious sociopaths Roy was putting together. A crew that comprised both good-looking and charismatic, popular guys like Borelli and Joey Testa, guys who would have looked down on Roy back in school, more than likely, and outsiders who Roy could better relate to, like Freddie and Chris, outsiders who would do anything for him. The DeMeo crew saw themselves as apex predators among Brooklyn's criminals, and Roy was the strongest among them. He was obsessed with killing and survival. When they'd practice surprising each other, nobody could ever get the drop on Roy. Henry Borelli even began to think DeMeo couldn't be killed by anybody. Freddie said that Roy was the smartest man he ever met. Soon, the DeMeo crew were murdering more and more, and Roy was at the center of it. His men had long since become desensitized to killing. Not only desensitized, many of them enjoyed it. Dominic Montiglio, he thought the violence was cartoonish at first, and then later, he'd become increasingly disgusted and horrified by it. The DeMeo crew bonded through fear and violence, and like a cult leader as much as the head of a crew, everybody obeyed Roy's commands without question. The DeMeo crew were terrorizing people all over Canarsie. Things were really bad in 1977, but in 1978, and even more so in 1979, things were going to get much worse. Somewhere, not far away, and not long after Quinn and Sherry's murder, Detective Joseph Winling was working at a Brooklyn precinct, that same precinct where Kenny Mccabe worked. That's when Winling received a very disturbing phone call from an informant. "You ought to check out what's going on in Canarsie. People are dropping like flies and nobody's getting locked up for it," the voice said, thick with fear. Winling listened carefully. Winling began hearing about the horrors that were happening around the Gemini Lounge, and there was just way too much consistency. Soon,
Windling and Mccabe would join forces. Windling would become like Roy's arch-nemesis. But another man, well, he'd be forced to confront it, because he was a part of it, and that meant confronting his uncle, the man who had destroyed his relationship with his father, and couldn't stand being confronted by anybody. It isn't easy knowing what to do when there's so much evil all around you.
Gold! 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 Yeah! Yeah! Gold! Why didn't I know there was gold in the sun? I'll get that too before I'm done. Yes, I will. Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye, everyone, everyone, come closer, closer, closer. There's gold in the sun, I saw it there, precious gold that is so rare. So get busy, everyone, build my wall to reach the sun.
Don't try too high to build your wall, 'cause the higher you go, the harder you fall.
If you value your lives and also your health, do as I bid, for I want more wealth. Higher, higher, more bricks. To build my wall, but I was greedy and I had a great